She signed a marriage contract with the most powerful man in the country. No love, no touch, no future. It was only for the money, only for 1 year. But no one told her what he would do the first time he discovered she was still a virgin. And no one told him that pretending to love a woman like her would be the only lie he could never keep until the end. What starts as a cold, calculated agreement will end where no one imagined. And the last night between them wasn't written in any contract. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Your like helps this channel grow and keep bringing emotional stories like this. Share it with someone special. The golden light of late afternoon poured through the glass facade of the Morgan Tower, casting long shadows across the polished marble floors of the 42nd floor. Outside, Manhattan pulsed with its usual urgency, cars honking, people rushing, lives colliding in the chaos of a city that never allowed anyone to pause. But inside Alexander Morgan's office, everything was silent. Almost too silent. Alexander sat motionless behind his sleek desk, his jaw clenched, dark brows furrowed in concentration as he read the last lines of the will his father had left behind. The document trembled faintly in his hand, though he'd never admit the source of the shake. It wasn't grief. His relationship with Henry Morgan had always been more business than blood, but this clause at the end, it was absurd. He had 3 months to get married, not fall in love, not build a life, just legally marry someone before his 36th birthday, or he would lose control of Morgan Holdings to the board, men who smiled to his face and sharpened their knives behind his back. Ridiculous, he muttered, tossing the papers onto the desk. Across from him, his lawyer, Thomas Reed, sat with legs crossed and fingers steepled. You know your father didn't trust anyone, not even you. He probably thought marriage would prove you capable of thinking beyond profits. Alexander exhaled sharply. This isn't about trust, it's about control, as always. Thomas leaned forward. There's another way. A strategic marriage, temporary, discreet, contractual. Alexander's eyes narrowed. You're suggesting I marry someone like I'm signing a merger agreement? Exactly. 1 year, paperwork clean. No emotional liabilities. Just enough to meet the requirement. Then you dissolve it quietly. Silence followed. Alexander's gaze drifted toward the skyline, the Empire State Building bathed in gold. He didn't need romance. He didn't even believe in it. But he needed that company, his legacy, his vision. The idea of marrying someone for convenience wasn't just a solution, it was survival. But who? He asked finally. Thomas hesitated, then smirked. You already know her. That same evening, Valerie James stepped out of the hospital cafeteria with a coffee she could barely afford and a phone full of unanswered calls from medical billing offices. Her mother's condition was deteriorating fast, and despite her long hours and promotions, nothing ever felt like enough. She paused in the corridor, the overhead lights buzzing faintly above her. Her fingers tightened around the coffee cup, her back against the wall. She'd spent the last 2 nights on the pull-out chair beside her mother's hospital bed, waking up every few hours to check her breathing, holding on to hope like it was slipping sand. The hospital's scent of antiseptic, distant sobs and tired fluorescent lights had become her life. That's when she heard it. His voice. Valerie. She looked up, and there he was. Alexander Morgan, in a tailored charcoal suit, standing in front of her like he didn't belong in such a place. He never did. His presence made the hallway feel smaller, warmer somehow, despite its sterile cold. "Mr. Morgan?" she asked, confused, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "May I talk to you just 5 minutes?" The way he said it, firm but not harsh, made her nod, despite everything in her screaming that she didn't have time for distractions. They sat at a corner table in the nearly empty cafeteria. She stirred her coffee, as if that would make it taste better. He didn't touch his. "I have a proposition," he said bluntly. Her eyebrows lifted. "A proposition? I need to get married before October. It's a requirement to inherit the Morgan legacy. I need someone I can trust, someone discreet, someone who won't expect romance or anything more." She stared at him. Surely he was joking. "I'll pay you $5 million. In return, you agree to a 1-year marriage. Legal, public, but emotionally neutral." She blinked. "Neutral? No intimacy, no obligations. You'll be protected, respected, and your privacy will be maintained. I'll also provide private care for your mother at the best facility in the city immediately." Her hands trembled slightly. She looked down, away from his eyes. This couldn't be real. "You think I'd sell myself for money?" "I think," he said softly, "you're someone who would do anything for someone you love, including making a difficult choice." For a moment, the room fell into a silence so heavy it almost had weight. Valerie's chest tightened, not from offense but from the awful truth that he might be right. Her mother was running out of time, and so was she. "I'm not answering now," she said quietly, rising from the table. "I wouldn't expect you to," he replied, standing as well. As she turned to walk away, her breath caught in her throat, not because of the proposal, but because for the first time in weeks, a door, strange, dangerous, but undeniably real, had opened before her, and she didn't yet know if stepping through it would save her life or break her completely. In the stillness of a Brooklyn morning, the quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound keeping Valerie company. The apartment was small, too small for dreams, yet large enough for memories. Light spilled through the thin curtains, touching the stack of medical bills on the kitchen counter, and the framed photo of a younger Valerie, beaming in a graduation cap, her mother standing proudly beside her. Valerie rubbed her tired eyes and glanced at the clock. 5:17 a.m. She'd barely slept, as usual. After her night shift at the Morgan Foundation office, she had come home, checked her mother's oxygen levels, adjusted her blankets, then sat on the edge of the bed listening to the shallow rise and fall of her breathing until dawn began to smear the sky with color. Carla James had been everything. A nurse in her younger days, Carla had raised Valerie alone after her father walked out when she was just 4. She never spoke poorly of him, never complained. She simply worked, saved, and gave. Every meal, every birthday, every scraped knee, her mother had been there. Strong, kind, unshakable, until the diagnosis. The words chronic kidney failure had come like a thunderclap in springtime. Valerie still remembered the sterile white of the doctor's coat, the way the words echoed in her head as if underwater. Her mother had tried to stay brave, joked about dialysis, called it her spa treatment. But the weight of it all, insurance denials, mounting bills, and the look in her mother's eyes when the pain grew unbearable, was turning Valerie's once orderly world into a storm she couldn't control. She worked long hours as Alexander Morgan's assistant. She never complained. She never missed a deadline. But the stress was a noose tightening around her chest. The bills weren't slowing down. The wait list for a transplant seemed endless, and despite all her efforts, it never felt like enough. There were nights she cried silently in the bathroom, biting down on a towel so her mother wouldn't hear. Nights she stared at the ceiling, wondering what kind of daughter she was if she couldn't save the one person who had given her everything. She remembered a winter night when her mother had been rushed to the ER, barely breathing. Valerie had stood outside the operating room, trembling in a thin sweater, praying into the void. That night, she'd felt something shift inside her, like part of her innocence had broken off and drifted into some unreachable place. After that, she stopped dreaming for herself. Every dollar she earned, every hour she sacrificed, was for Carla. Valerie's life had become a machine, efficient, functional, but devoid of softness. She had locked away every romantic notion, every youthful fantasy of falling in love, traveling, or even having a night out with friends. Those things were luxuries for people who didn't carry the world on their backs, and yet, despite all the pressure, she carried herself with grace. Even Alexander, who rarely noticed anything beyond performance, had once paused to watch her help a panicked intern without raising her voice. There was a strength in her stillness, a kind of beauty in her quiet resilience. People assumed she was cold. She wasn't. She was simply focused and tired. So deeply tired. In the rare hours she had to herself, Valerie found solace in simple things. Music, mostly. Jazz in the mornings while she made coffee. Old love songs when she folded laundry. Her mother used to sing around the apartment, humming Billie Holiday and Nat King Cole while sweeping the floor. and Valerie would twirl in her pajamas, pretending she was at a ball. Those moments felt like a different lifetime now. One afternoon, while sorting old papers, Valerie found a notebook she had kept in high school. In it, she'd written down dreams in careful script: study abroad in Paris, write a novel, fall in love. She had closed the notebook, her throat tight. She wasn't angry at life, just quietly heartbroken that she had to let so much go. So when Alexander Morgan walked into that hospital cafeteria and offered a contract in exchange for her freedom, it wasn't just the money that shook her. It was the way he looked at her, like she was capable of handling something so impossible. He had no idea that Valerie wasn't afraid of sacrifice. She was afraid of hope, because hope, unlike hardship, came with the risk of losing again. Still, as she sat on the edge of her mother's hospital bed that evening, watching Carla sleep, Valerie knew something had changed. She stared at her mother's pale face, her chest rising and falling, and felt the weight of 100 unanswered prayers pressing down on her ribs. There was no cavalry coming, no miracle, just this one terrifying offer from a man she barely knew, and the question that haunted her now wasn't whether she could trust him, but whether she could trust herself not to feel anything at all. The hospital cafeteria smelled faintly of overbrewed coffee and microwave-heated meals. It was one of those in-between places where time hung in the air like fog, too quiet for comfort, too busy to offer peace. Valerie sat alone at a table near the window, her shoulders slightly hunched, the pale light catching on the dark circles under her eyes. She stirred a cup of tea she hadn't touched. The spoon clinked gently against porcelain, a rhythmic echo of the storm inside her. Her phone buzzed, lighting up with another reminder: medical invoice due, $12,843. She let the screen go dark without reading the rest. She didn't notice Alexander approaching until his shadow stretched across the table. "May I sit?" he asked, his voice low, controlled. Valerie looked up, startled but composed. He was in a charcoal coat, no tie, his hair damp from the soft winter drizzle outside. Somehow, even in a place like this, he didn't seem out of place, just unshakably self-contained. She nodded slowly. Of course. He sat across from her, placing a small folder on the table between them. His eyes weren't cold, but there was a firmness in them, a quiet urgency. "I know it's an unusual situation," he began. Valerie folded her hands in her lap. "Unusual is a polite word for it." Alexander allowed himself the faintest smile before he opened the folder. Inside were neatly arranged pages, a printed contract with legal headers and highlighted sections. It looked more like a corporate acquisition than anything remotely personal. "I had my lawyers draw up a preliminary agreement. Nothing binding until you sign, of course," he said, pushing it toward her. "But I wanted to be clear about every detail." She didn't reach for it. "You want to marry me?" "Yes," he replied plainly. "On paper. For 12 months. We'll maintain appearances in public, play our roles when needed, and at the end we dissolve the union cleanly." "No physical expectations?" she asked, her voice steady but low. He shook his head. "None. That's entirely your boundary to define. There will be no intimacy unless you ever want that to change." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that in the contract?" He gave her a direct look. "It's not something I would ever enforce." Valerie leaned back slightly. Her fingers were cold. "And in exchange?" $5 million, he said. $1 million will be transferred to you before the wedding. The remaining $4 million will be deposited in a separate account upon completion of the agreement." "And my mother?" "She'll be moved to a private facility in Manhattan. Top-tier care. Same doctors. No expense spared. That begins the moment you agree." The weight of it all pressed on her chest. She glanced again at the contract, but still didn't touch it. "Why me?" she asked finally. He didn't hesitate. "Because you're loyal, discreet, intelligent. I've observed how you operate under pressure. You don't seek attention. You get things done. I don't want someone looking for a spotlight. I want someone who understands this is a transaction, a role. Nothing more." His words were sharp, but his tone wasn't. There was a strange, buried respect in it. Valerie looked down at her tea. "You could have chosen anyone." "I could have," he said. "But I trust you." That startled her. Not because she didn't believe it, but because no one had said that to her in a long time. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she took a breath. "I have conditions." He leaned forward slightly, attentive. "1," she said, lifting a finger. "The first $1 million must be deposited before the ceremony, no delays." "Agreed." 2. "My mother's transfer has to happen immediately. I want full access to her records and the right to oversee her treatment." He nodded. "Of course." 3, she said, meeting his eyes for the first time since he sat down. "We sleep in separate rooms. No pretending behind closed doors. I'm not interested in blurring lines." His expression didn't change. "Understood." "And finally," her voice softened just slightly, "no cameras, no press manipulation. If I agree to do this, it's for survival, not to become a tabloid headline." Alexander's jaw flexed, but he nodded. "I'll instruct my PR team accordingly." There was a long silence after that, the kind that didn't ask to be filled. Finally, Valerie picked up the contract. She flipped through the pages slowly, her fingers brushing over the clauses like they were thorns. She didn't flinch. She had read worse things in hospital billing statements. This was oddly clean, clinical, safe even in its own way, but safe could also mean dangerous when it made you forget how much you were giving up. "I need 24 hours, she said. "Take 48, he offered, standing. As he turned to leave, Valerie called after him. "Mr. Morgan." He stopped. "If I say yes..." Her voice faltered, then found its footing. "What happens next?" Alexander turned, eyes darker now in the soft cafeteria lighting. "Then I become your husband, and you become the woman who saved everything I've built." He didn't wait for a reply. And as Valerie watched him disappear through the glass doors into the hallway, contract in hand, a strange chill crept down her spine. Not of fear, but of knowing that if she said yes, there'd be no going back. The air in Alexander's penthouse office was colder than usual, the silence heavy like fog pressing against glass. Rain tapped softly on the windows that overlooked the endless stretch of Manhattan, and the sky had turned the same color as steel. Valerie sat across from him at the long mahogany table, her posture straight, chin slightly lifted. She wore a navy blue blouse, modest but elegant, and her hair was pulled back into a neat twist. Her fingers were interlaced on her lap, hiding the tremor she refused to show. The contract lay between them, revised, double-checked, and legally bulletproof. "I reviewed every clause," she said calmly, though her throat was dry, "and I'm willing to proceed, under 3 final conditions." Alexander didn't flinch. He folded his hands and nodded. "Go on." 1, she said, eyes fixed on him. "The first payment must clear into my account by this Friday. Not a verbal promise. Actual funds." "Done," he said without hesitation. 2, I want full authority to approve or deny any public appearances involving me. I'll play the part when necessary, but I won't be paraded for press benefit." He nodded again. "Understood. You'll have final say on all events." And 3, her voice dipped lower, "We keep separate rooms, always. This stays strictly professional. I will not wake up one day to blurred lines." A small flicker crossed his face, something unnameable, but it was gone as quickly as it came. "You have my word," he said. "You'll be respected. Every step of the way." Valerie exhaled slowly. "Good." He leaned forward slightly, his tone shifting just enough to sound less like a CEO and more like a man, curious, almost cautious. "Are you certain you want to do this?" She hesitated. "No," she admitted, "but certainty isn't a luxury I've ever had." Their eyes met. For a moment, neither blinked. Then Alexander stood, straightening his suit jacket, his movements precise and rehearsed. He walked to the minibar and poured 2 glasses of water, not offering anything stronger. He placed one in front of her. "No champagne to celebrate?" she asked, trying to mask the tightness in her chest with dry humor. He looked at her. "This isn't a celebration. It's a transaction." She nodded, appreciating the honesty, even if it stung more than she expected. As she reached for the glass, her fingers brushed his, just for a second. It was brief and accidental, but something shifted. A static current in the air. She withdrew quickly, pretending not to notice. Alexander, however, paused before sitting back down. "I've also taken care of the transfer," he said, Your mother is being moved to the Lenox Hill Private Clinic tomorrow morning. Full cardiac and renal team will be at her disposal. You'll receive the full treatment plan tonight." Valerie swallowed hard. "Thank you." He looked at her carefully. "I'm not doing this as a favor." "I know," she said, "but I'm still grateful." They returned to silence, the only sound being the soft ticking of the silver clock on the wall. After a few moments, Valerie opened her leather purse and pulled out a black pen. She looked at the contract for a long beat, as if waiting for the page to speak. Then she signed. Her signature was elegant, clean, controlled. When she looked up, she expected to see satisfaction in his eyes. Instead, she saw something colder, distant. Alexander reached for the document and added his signature in silence. No theatrics, no smile. "It's done," he said. The words hit heavier than she expected, as if something irreversible had just begun. He handed her a sleek white envelope, inside a detailed schedule of public appearances, the list of designers already assigned to curate her new image, and the official date of the wedding, February 18th. 3 weeks. 3 weeks to become someone else. She stood. "I should go. My mother needs me." He nodded once. "My driver will take you home." Valerie stepped toward the door, her heels tapping against the polished floor. But just before crossing the threshold, she paused. "Mr. Morgan," she said without turning. He looked up. "Do you ever get the feeling," she asked quietly, "that a decision you made to protect yourself might end up exposing something you didn't even know you were hiding?" His face was unreadable for a moment. Then he answered, low and measured, "Every day." She left without saying another word. And as the elevator doors closed around her, Valerie felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not fear, not guilt, but the unsettling weight of possibility. The boutique was more gallery than store, high ceilings, champagne lighting, and gowns displayed like priceless art pieces. Valerie stood in front of a floor-length mirror, her arms crossed over her chest, her reflection unfamiliar. She was wearing a pale ivory evening gown that draped elegantly off her shoulders, the silk hugging her body in ways that felt both powerful and exposed. Her dark hair had been styled into soft waves, pinned lightly at the sides to show the curve of her neck. Her lips bore a shade of red she had never dared to wear before. "You're stiff," said a calm voice behind her. Sophia Vega, the image consultant hired by Alexander's team, stepped closer, adjusting the neckline with delicate precision. "I'm not used to being a mannequin," Valerie replied dryly, still staring at the mirror. "You're not," Sophia said. "You're becoming a message." Valerie frowned. "What message?" "That you belong in his world." There was no cruelty in Sophia's tone, only fact. Over the next 10 days, Valerie was immersed in a whirlwind of fittings, etiquette coaching, media training, and personal styling. She learned how to walk in heels without faltering, how to keep her gaze composed under camera flashes, how to smile just enough without revealing too much. She was taught which fork to use at which course, how to cross her legs on camera, how to answer invasive questions with charm and controlled vagueness. And through it all, Sophia remained by her side, firm, honest, and oddly maternal. She didn't flatter. She prepared. "You're going to be seen," Sophia told her during a final rehearsal before the gala, "by more people than ever before, and they'll try to define you before you open your mouth. You must decide who you are before they do." Valerie didn't answer then. She wasn't sure who she was anymore. The night before the gala, she returned to her small Brooklyn apartment for the last time. The boxes were packed. The landlord had been paid 6 months in advance to hold the place, just in case. She walked slowly through each room, touching the chipped edges of the kitchen counter, the blanket draped over the couch, her mother's prayer beads on the nightstand. Her life had always been defined by purpose, survival, sacrifice, duty. Now, for the first time, her role was about illusion. In the bathroom mirror, she stared at herself, flawless makeup, designer dress hanging on the door behind her, the faint scent of roses from the expensive lotion Sophia had insisted she use. And yet, beneath the gloss, the ache remained. Who is this woman? She didn't recognize the softness in her own lips, or the steel behind her eyes. The next evening, a sleek black car picked her up, and drove her through the heart of Manhattan. Her mother had already been moved to the private clinic and was receiving care beyond what Valerie could have imagined. The reports were hopeful. The driver opened her door, and she stepped out onto the red carpet of the Four Seasons Hotel, where the American Heart Foundation's annual gala was already underway. Cameras flashed. Voices called her name. Her name. "Valerie James! Over here!" She felt her breath catch. She had been briefed for this moment, but nothing prepared her for the sudden heat of the spotlight. Alexander was already waiting at the top of the marble stairs, dressed in a black tuxedo that fit him like a second skin. He extended his hand to her. For a moment the world dimmed. The noise faded. She placed her hand in his. His fingers were warm, firm, and there was something in his eyes, a flicker of approval, maybe even pride, but it was quickly replaced with the calm detachment he always wore in public. "You look prepared," he said. "Not beautiful," she teased, surprising even herself. His gaze lingered on her lips, then drifted to her eyes. That would be a dangerous thing to say. He escorted her inside. They moved as one through the crowd, champagne glasses clinking, laughter echoing off chandeliers, orchestral music swelling through the ballroom. The elite of New York whispered and watched, trying to decode her. Alexander played the part perfectly. A devoted fiancé, proud and protective. He laughed at her witty remarks, touched her lower back when they walked, whispered something in her ear that made her blush, though she couldn't even remember what he said, and she played along. But somewhere between the charade and the music, something shifted. She wasn't just performing, she was starting to feel. Later, as they stepped onto the hotel's balcony for air, the city glittering below, Valerie turned to him. "You've done this before, haven't you? Played pretend." Alexander looked out at the skyline. "More times than I can count, but never with someone who made it feel like it wasn't an act." The words hung in the space between them, unspoken, but heavy. Then a flash went off behind them. A photographer. Reflexively, Alexander turned and kissed her cheek. But instead of pulling back, Valerie didn't move. Her breath stilled, and for a second, just 1 second, she wondered what it would feel like if the next kiss wasn't for the cameras. By morning, Valerie James's name was everywhere. The billionaire's bride-to-be. Who is Valerie James? Mystery woman steals spotlight at gala. From assistant to heiress, Alexander Morgan's fiancée breaks the mold. The headlines didn't stop. Social media was flooded with photos of the couple, her hand resting lightly on his chest, their whispered exchange on the balcony, the kiss on her cheek. They looked like a fairy tale, polished, poised, perfect. But inside Valerie, nothing felt perfect. She sat in the back seat of the black Bentley that morning, staring out at the blur of the city, her phone vibrating non-stop in her lap. Sophia had already called to congratulate her on a flawless debut. Publicists were thrilled. Designers were offering gowns. Media outlets wanted exclusive interviews. Her inbox looked like it belonged to someone else. She still hadn't replied to any of it. "Was that everything you expected?" Alexander asked beside her, voice low and unreadable. Valerie turned to him. "If you mean the cameras, the whispers, the woman in the bathroom who asked if I was an escort, yes, it was exactly what I expected." He didn't smile, but he didn't flinch either. "And the rest?" She looked back out the window. "I didn't expect to enjoy any of it." His gaze remained on her profile for a moment longer before he turned away. They arrived at the Morgan estate in Beverly Hills by afternoon. The mansion loomed like a silent fortress, modern, cold, and blindingly white. As the staff opened the doors and took their coats, Valerie paused at the threshold. This would be home now, a place with separate bedrooms, separate intentions, separate truths. "Let me show you to your room," Alexander said, his tone reverting to its formal edge. She followed him through the grand hallway, past glass walls and minimalist art pieces, until he stopped in front of a suite. The doors were tall and heavy, made of dark wood that contrasted with the pristine decor. "This is yours. The staff has stocked the closet. If anything is missing, let me know." She stepped inside. It was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a king-sized bed with crisp white linens, a private terrace, even a baby grand piano in the corner. But it didn't feel like hers. Not yet. Not even close. She turned back toward him. "And you're just down the hall?" He nodded. "If you need anything, I'm available, but we'll keep our spaces separate, as agreed." Valerie hesitated. "Do you always keep your promises?" Alexander's jaw tightened slightly. "When I make them, yes." The silence between them lingered longer than necessary. Then he nodded once and left, the door clicking shut behind him. She stood there for a long moment, alone in the quiet luxury. It wasn't that she doubted him. It was that she didn't know if she could trust herself, not to blur the line they had drawn together. That night she wandered out onto her terrace. Below, the garden stretched like a painting, the pool reflecting the soft lights of the house. Everything was beautiful, orchestrated, but something inside her felt restless. There was a knock at the door. She froze. When she opened it, Alexander stood there in a navy sweater and dark jeans, far from the suits he wore like armor. "I'm going for a walk in the garden," he said simply. "Would you like to join me?" She blinked, surprised. "Now?" "No photographers, no press, just air." She hesitated, then nodded. They walked in silence for several minutes. The night air was cool, the scent of jasmine lingering in the breeze. Their steps were slow, unhurried, their shoulders sometimes brushing. "This place doesn't feel like you," she said softly, glancing around. "It isn't," he admitted. "It's what was expected of me." "And what would you have chosen?" Alexander stopped beside the fountain, his hands in his pockets. Something smaller, quieter, something with music. She tilted her head. "You don't strike me as quiet. You don't strike me as someone who signs contracts with strangers." They exchanged a glance, both half smiling. For once, not for the cameras. As they turned back toward the house, she noticed the way he walked. Shoulders relaxed, not the rigid posture he wore in boardrooms. Something about this version of him felt real, and that frightened her, because if he could drop the mask, she might do the same. As they reached the patio steps, he looked at her and asked, "Do you regret any of this?" She didn't answer. Not because she didn't know, but because she was starting to wonder if the only thing she might regret was not letting herself feel more. Snow had dusted the grounds of the Connecticut estate overnight, covering the rolling fields like a blessing in white. The air smelled of pine and frost, and everything, trees, roofs, even the delicate iron gates, gleamed as if dipped in silver. Valerie stood at the edge of the window, in a room that was too beautiful to feel real. The satin of her gown shimmered in the pale morning light, its classic lines hugging her waist before flowing into a soft train. No lace, no sparkle, just purity and elegance. The stylist had offered more extravagant options, but Valerie had chosen this one. Simple. Quiet. Strong. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the veil. Not out of fear, she had faced worse, but because this felt like the crossing of a line she'd spent her life avoiding. Behind her, Sophia stood silently, pinning the final strand of hair in place. "You look like a woman no one will forget," she said softly. Valerie offered a faint smile in the mirror. "I don't want to be unforgettable. I just want to get through this." Sophia placed a steady hand on her shoulder. "Then do it your way. One breath at a time." Downstairs, Carla James was already seated in the front row of the intimate ceremony space. The move to the private clinic had done wonders. Her color had returned, and her eyes sparkled with something Valerie hadn't seen in months: peace. She held a tissue, already dabbing at tears before anything had begun. To Carla, this was the happy ending her daughter deserved. A fairy tale after a life of struggle. A man who would take care of her. A future that, finally, didn't ask for sacrifice. Valerie couldn't bear to tell her the truth. Not today. The ceremony was held in a glass pavilion nestled between tall fir trees. No more than 40 guests were present. Investors, family, a few socialites, and a handful of journalists carefully selected by Alexander's PR team. Everything had been choreographed to perfection, except for the way her heart beat when she saw him waiting at the end of the aisle. Alexander Morgan stood tall in a tailored black suit, no tie, just a crisp white shirt, and a quiet stillness that drew attention without asking for it. His eyes met hers the moment she entered, and for a breath the entire room fell away. He didn't smile. Neither did she. But something passed between them, an understanding, a kind of reverent silence that said, "We are doing this, and we are not pretending it doesn't matter." Valerie walked slowly, the hem of her gown whispering against the polished floor. Every step was deliberate, every heartbeat loud. As she reached him, Alexander extended his hand. She took it. His fingers wrapped around hers with surprising gentleness, warm, steady, like he wasn't offering a role, but an anchor. The officiant began to speak, but Valerie barely heard the words. Her mind blurred everything but him, his scent, clean and faintly like cedar, the sound of his breath just above the vows, the way his thumb moved once, subtly, across the back of her hand, as if to remind her she wasn't alone. When it was time for the rings, Alexander reached into his pocket and produced a simple gold band. No diamonds, no inscription, just something real. He slid it onto her finger slowly, looking her in the eyes. Then she did the same. The moment the officiant declared them husband and wife, there was polite applause, a few camera clicks, the rustle of expensive fabric. Carla wept openly, and Sophia discreetly wiped a corner of her eye. Alexander leaned forward and kissed Valerie's cheek. It was brief, chaste, but her skin burned where his lips touched. They turned to face the guests together, hands still clasped. Valerie couldn't explain the way her body felt in that moment, like she was walking on the edge of something vast and unknowable. She had expected to feel trapped. Instead, she felt tethered, not by the contract, by him. The reception that followed was modest by billionaire standards. Candlelit tables, a soft quartet playing jazz, trays of delicate hors d'oeuvres circulating like clockwork. Alexander stayed close but never imposing. He introduced her to everyone with quiet pride, never overplaying the act. And when they danced, because yes, there had to be a first dance, he held her with the kind of stillness that wasn't performative, but protective. "You move like someone who's done this before," she murmured, her hand on his shoulder. "I haven't," he said, "not like this." Their eyes met again, and neither looked away. Later that evening, Valerie slipped away to check on her mother, who was sitting near the fireplace, a blanket draped over her knees and a contented smile on her face. "You were glowing," Carla said, reaching for her hand. "He loves you. I can see it." Valerie swallowed the knot in her throat. "He takes care of what he values." Carla squeezed her hand. "So do you, that's why you're going to be just fine." As she returned to the ballroom, Valerie caught sight of Alexander standing alone by the bar, his profile sharp against the golden light. He looked conflicted, not unhappy but far from settled. She wanted to ask him what he was thinking. She didn't. Instead, she crossed the room, took her place beside him, and whispered, "I think we fooled them." He looked at her, long and hard. "Did we?" The question lingered in the air between them, more dangerous than any vow they'd made. From a distance, they were the perfect couple. Magazine covers called them New York's most intriguing power duo. Photographers captured stolen glances at galas, matching steps on charity red carpets, synchronized elegance during board meetings and ribbon cuttings. The headlines sold a fantasy. They looked the part, flawlessly. But behind the tall iron gates of the Morgan estate in Beverly Hills, the truth was quieter, colder, still. Alexander and Valerie lived in the same house but in different worlds. Her suite was on the east wing, his on the west. In between stretched long hallways of silence. Staff came and went like ghosts, efficient, polite, trained not to notice the absence of warmth. Each morning their routines unfolded like clockwork. Valerie would rise early, prepare her own tea despite the kitchen staff's insistence, and spend a moment by the terrace before dressing for the day's appearances. Alexander, always impeccably timed, would meet her at the base of the stairs just before they left for whatever public duty awaited them. Sometimes they spoke, mostly they didn't need to. Their choreography had become instinctive, the perfect pause before cameras, the gentle brush of fingers on her back during interviews, the glance he'd give when she said something clever, an unspoken cue that they were indeed winning the game. But in private, the mask peeled away. Dinners were often silent, eaten on opposite ends of a long polished table. If either spoke, it was business. Updates on foundation work, public image strategy, stock market shifts, weather. Valerie took on a new role as coordinator of the Morgan Foundation's outreach projects. She visited schools in underserved communities, launched literacy campaigns, sat beside children as they read their first books. The warmth she poured into the work felt real, purposeful. Alexander rarely joined her at these events, though she sometimes caught him watching the video reports later, his expression unreadable. At night, when the house fell quiet, she'd sit at the piano in her room, the one no one else touched, and play softly to herself. Classical pieces at first, then improvised ones. Eventually she began composing again, just fragments, melodies that sounded like memories never fully formed. Sometimes, standing on his balcony across the courtyard, Alexander would hear the notes drifting through the evening air. He never said anything about it. But he never closed his window. They didn't speak of the marriage, of the contract, of what came after. But little things started to shift. One morning Valerie found a book outside her door, Love in the Time of Cholera, her favorite, though she'd never told him. Inside the front cover there was no note, just a pressed magnolia blossom, perfectly preserved. A week later, she left a white rose in the entryway to his study. A silent answer. On another evening, after a tense charity event, Valerie stood barefoot in the kitchen long after the staff had gone. She poured herself a glass of water and turned to find Alexander there, sleeves rolled up, no jacket, tie long abandoned. "You hate those things, don't you?" he asked, reaching for a glass. "What things?" The forced laughter, the questions, the way they look at you like you're not real. She tilted her head. "I thought you loved control." "I do," he said. "But I'm starting to hate pretense." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe you're becoming human." The silence after that was almost warm. Still, they returned to their routines. Separate rooms, separate beds, separate hearts, at least in theory. But the distance wasn't as vast as it used to be. One night a storm swept through the hills, rattling windows and cutting the power briefly. Valerie, startled awake, stepped out of her room and nearly collided with Alexander, who had come to check the generator. They stood there, in the darkened hallway, inches apart. She expected him to retreat. He didn't. Their eyes adjusted slowly to the dim moonlight, and something passed between them, a silent current of recognition. "I'm fine," she whispered. He didn't ask. He just stood there a moment longer, and then reached out, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was barely there, but it left her skin tingling long after he turned and walked away. That night she didn't sleep. Neither did he. The house, so perfectly curated and maintained, had begun to feel like a container too small for the truth it was trying to hold. And deep down, Valerie was beginning to wonder how long two people could pretend not to care before the pretending started to hurt more than the truth. The sky above Beverly Hills was a vast canvas of midnight blue, brushed with scattered stars. A rare meteor shower had been forecasted, the kind of celestial event that felt too magical to belong to a world governed by contracts and calendars. Valerie stood on the balcony outside her suite, wrapped in a soft cream shawl, staring up. The city lights below shimmered like distant constellations, but her eyes were fixed on the heavens. For once the house was silent. No staff, no schedule, just air and sky. A quiet knock on her door. She turned. Alexander. Dressed in black slacks and a simple long-sleeved shirt, he looked more like the man she saw in rare, unguarded moments. Not the CEO, not the curated husband, but someone in between, someone real. "I thought you might be out here," he said. She offered a small smile. "Didn't strike me as the stargazing type." "I'm not," he admitted, "but I read that tonight was rare. And lately, I find myself interested in rare things." She didn't respond, not with words. Instead, she stepped aside. He joined her on the balcony, and for a while they stood in silence, side by side, gazing upward. A soft wind moved around them, carrying the scent of orange blossoms from the garden below. "You ever make a wish?" he asked quietly. "I used to," she said, "before I realized wishes don't pay medical bills." He glanced at her, but didn't argue. Another meteor streaked across the sky, a sudden brilliant arc of light that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Valerie inhaled deeply. "When I was a girl, I thought if I counted 100 stars without blinking, something good would happen. And did it? She turned to him, her expression softer than he'd ever seen. Eventually. You offered me $5 million and the best doctors in the state. Alexander looked away. That wasn't a gift. It was a negotiation. I know, she said, but for someone who insists it's all a transaction, you're surprisingly careful with my feelings. His jaw tensed slightly. You've been careful with mine too. The words hung in the air like the stars, suspended, waiting. Valerie crossed her arms, rubbing her sleeves. Sometimes I wonder if we're both just pretending not to feel anything, because that's what we agreed to do. Alexander turned to face her fully. And what if we stopped pretending? She froze. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was charged, heavy with all the things they hadn't said. She spoke first. I don't know what's real anymore. This contract, this house, the way you look at me when no one else is watching. His voice was low. That's real. Their eyes locked. Another meteor blazed overhead, unnoticed. She stepped closer, her breath catching as his hand reached up, hesitant, gentle, and brushed the hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered at her jawline. Slowly, deliberately. She didn't move. He searched her eyes. Tell me to stop, but she didn't, because nothing in her wanted to. He leaned in, and then the kiss, not for the cameras, not rehearsed, not written in any contract. It was slow, uncertain at first, then deeper, warmer, like a language neither of them had spoken in years, but still remembered. His hand moved to her waist, hers to his chest, and for a moment, the world, the house, the expectations, the past, disappeared. There was only breath and skin and longing held too tightly for too long. When they finally parted, their foreheads touched, breaths mingling in the cool night. Neither spoke. They didn't need to, because the kiss had already said it all. But Valerie knew something had changed, not just between them, inside her. She wasn't afraid of the contract ending. She was afraid of what might begin in its place. The morning after the kiss felt different. Not because anything more had happened. They had returned to their separate rooms as if silently agreeing not to push too far, too fast, but because something invisible had shifted. The space between them wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with tension, warmth, and questions that neither dared to voice. Valerie kept busy, meetings with the foundation, phone calls with doctors about her mother's improving condition, a delivery of new campaign materials. But all day her mind kept circling back to the way Alexander had kissed her, with care, with heat, with hesitation, and something else, something fragile. That night, after dinner, he invited her to share a glass of wine in the garden. No staff, no cameras, just them, and the soft hum of crickets weaving through the stillness. They sat across from each other under the pergola, surrounded by hanging lights that flickered like fireflies. The night was warm, but her skin tingled with a nervous chill. I was thinking about Paris, Alexander said suddenly, swirling the wine in his glass. I went there once, years ago, alone. She tilted her head. You don't strike me as someone who travels without an agenda. I didn't then either, but I thought maybe if I went far enough from who I was expected to be, I might find out who I actually was. And did you? No, he said. But I found out I hated being alone. Valerie looked down at her hands. The candlelight danced over her fingers. She inhaled slowly, then looked at him. There's something you don't know about me, she said, voice quiet. He sat up slightly, alert, but not alarmed. Okay. I've never been with anyone. He blinked once, processing. You mean, I'm still a virgin, yes, she said, not blinking. Not because I was saving myself. Not because of faith or fear. I just never had time or space or anyone who made me feel safe enough to let go. He didn't speak. He didn't look away either. She continued, her voice steady but low. For most of my life, I've been too busy keeping people alive to figure out how to be soft. Every part of me was survival. And even when I thought I wanted romance, I didn't trust it. I thought it would take something from me I couldn't afford to lose. He set his glass down carefully, then leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Valerie," he said, voice low, "you've never owed anyone an explanation for how you've protected your heart, least of all me." She searched his eyes. "But I wanted you to know, because last night, that kiss, it didn't feel like pretending. And if we go further, I need you to understand who I am. Not the woman in the magazines, not the Mrs. Morgan everyone sees." He reached out slowly and placed his hand over hers. Not possessive, not persuasive, just there, solid, warm. "I see you," he said softly. "I've been seeing you every day." Something in her chest cracked, not painfully but like a door opening after years of being locked. He added after a pause, "And I didn't expect it. But I think I'm falling for you." The words were quiet. No fireworks, no dramatic music, but they hit her with the force of something too honest to ignore. He wasn't confessing to win her. He was confessing because not saying it had become harder than saying it. For a moment she couldn't breathe. She looked down at their hands, his thumb gently moving over her knuckles, and whispered, "I don't know if I'm ready." He didn't pull away. "I'll wait," he said. She looked up at him, and for the first time since the wedding, let her guard fall completely. Not with a kiss, not with a touch, but with her silence, the kind that trusts someone else to hold it without needing to fill it. And in that moment, sitting beneath the lights with no contract between them and no script to follow, Valerie didn't feel like someone pretending to be a wife. She felt like a woman learning for the first time what it meant to be chosen, not because of a deal but despite it. The Morgan estate in upstate New York wasn't grand in the way Beverly Hills was. It was older, quieter. The kind of wealth that didn't advertise itself with polished marble or gold fixtures, but with silence, antique furniture, and generations of curated elegance. Valerie had never been so aware of her own heartbeat as she was walking up the stone steps of the house. "She prefers intimate dinners," Alexander had told her in the car. "No press, no staff lingering, just conversation." Valerie had nodded, masking the anxiety behind her lashes. She had stood before boardrooms, press walls, and society's coldest stares, but meeting Margaret Morgan was a different kind of battlefield, one where charm wasn't enough, one where sincerity would either be your weapon or your undoing. Margaret received them in the drawing room, standing tall in a navy silk blouse and tailored cream trousers. Her silver hair was swept into an impeccable chignon, and her eyes, sharp, assessing, missed nothing. "Valerie," she said, extending a hand. "I've been expecting this." Valerie shook her hand, firm, controlled. "It's an honor, Mrs. Morgan." Margaret's smile was polite. "We'll see." Dinner was served in a candle-lit room with high ceilings and an old-world air. A single long table stretched across the room, but only 3 places were set. No staff remained inside. Everything had been laid in advance. The meal began with soft questions. "So, Valerie," Margaret said over a glass of Bordeaux, "how long have you worked with Alexander?" "Almost 2 years." "And how long have you been married?" Valerie met her gaze. "Just over 6 weeks." Margaret tilted her head. "It's all been quite fast." Valerie didn't flinch. "Sometimes life doesn't wait." The older woman nodded slowly, clearly filing that answer away. Alexander, for once, was quiet, observing. The conversation turned to literature, art, music. Margaret was testing her, not for culture but for authenticity. Valerie answered honestly. She spoke of her mother's love for old love songs, her own habit of playing piano to clear her mind, her disinterest in modern art that felt more performance than soul. And then, unexpectedly, Margaret smiled. "You know," she said, sipping her wine, "Alexander used to play piano too." Valerie turned. "You did?" He cleared his throat. "Years ago. His father hated it," Margaret added. "Thought music was a distraction. But I remember hearing Chopin through the halls at night. He'd sneak into the conservatory when everyone was asleep." Valerie looked at him differently in that moment, not just as a man hardened by business and control, but as someone who had once had secrets that weren't strategy, but survival. After dessert, Margaret stood and invited Valerie to join her in the solarium, alone. The room was warm, filled with plants and soft lamps. Outside, snow had begun to fall. Margaret poured tea into delicate porcelain cups and handed one to her guest. "You're not what I expected," she said. Valerie raised an eyebrow. "I imagine I'm not the first woman who's surprised you." "No, but you're the first one who doesn't try to impress me." Valerie smiled faintly. "Is that a compliment?" "It's a warning." Valerie grew still. "I've watched Alexander become a man who trusts no one, who builds walls so high he can barely breathe inside them. So when I saw him bring you here, I assumed you were another mask, another strategy, but you're not pretending." Valerie remained silent. Margaret sipped her tea, then said, "Tell me, Valerie, why do you love my son?" The question hit like a piano chord, dropped in a still room. Valerie could have deflected, could have lied, but she didn't. She set down her cup and folded her hands in her lap. "I don't know if it's love yet," she said honestly, "but I admire him. Not the public version, not the tycoon. I admire the boy who used to play piano in secret, the man who honors his word even when it costs him, the one who listens in silence when others would fill the space with ego." She paused. "And when he looks at me like I matter, even when I don't know how to believe it, I want to become the kind of woman who deserves that look." Margaret didn't blink. Her expression was unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. "That," she said softly, "is the most honest thing I've heard in years." They sat in silence for a while, steam rising from their cups. When they returned to the drawing room, Alexander stood as they entered, his eyes searching Valerie's. Margaret walked past him and placed a hand on his arm. "She's not here for what you can give her. Be careful not to lose her by forgetting what you need." Then she kissed his cheek and left the room. Valerie stood still, unsure what had just happened. Alexander turned to her, something like awe in his eyes. "She likes you. She scares me. She scares everyone." They shared a quiet laugh. And in that shared moment, something between them settled deeper. Not passion, not play, but trust. But as they prepared to leave, Valerie knew something had changed. Not in Margaret, not even in Alexander, but in herself. Because for the first time, she wasn't afraid of who she was in his world. She was beginning to wonder if she belonged there. The sound of rain against the glass was soft, almost like a lullaby. In Beverly Hills, rain was rare, and when it came, it made the whole world feel quieter, slower. Valerie stood by the window of the music room, watching the drops trail down the glass like silver threads. Her fingers rested lightly on the piano keys, though she wasn't playing. Not tonight. Behind her, on the polished surface of the grand piano, sat a sheet of music they'd been working on for weeks. It had started as something playful, an idea born of a moment between glances, but it had grown, transformed, like them. It used to be called Unexpected Contract, but tonight she had crossed it out. In neat, careful handwriting, she had renamed it New Beginning. Alexander stepped into the room quietly, but she sensed him the moment he entered. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside her, close enough to feel, far enough to respect the space between them. She looked up. "Do you ever think about the first night we met?" "I think about it more than I should," he replied. "I thought you were the most dangerous man I'd ever met." He smiled softly. "I was." She turned to face him fully, her breath shallow, heart pounding in a rhythm she couldn't hide anymore. "And now?" He stepped closer, eyes locked on hers. "Now, I'm just a man who's terrified of losing you." Valerie's voice trembled. "There's nothing left to lose. We've already given each other everything." His hand found hers, fingers threading with deliberate tenderness. "No," he whispered. "We haven't. Not yet." She didn't answer. Instead, she led him, silently, to her room. No rehearsed lines, no contract between them. Just air thick with anticipation, and the quiet certainty that this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The room was lit only by the rain-muted glow of the city beyond the windows. Valerie stood in the doorway, her eyes searching his, her body still, like she needed one more breath before everything changed. Alexander reached for her, but slowly, as if giving her every chance to retreat. She didn't. She stepped into him, their lips meeting in a kiss that was no longer cautious or stolen. It was deep, slow, and reverent. His hands framed her face like she was something breakable. Hers slid up the back of his neck, grounding herself in the feel of him. Each layer of clothing came away like a shedding of fear. He carried her to the bed with the kind of care that made her forget there had ever been a time she didn't trust him. When they finally lay together, skin against skin, everything else disappeared. The signatures, the rules, the pretending. It wasn't just physical. It was the unraveling of walls, the surrender of breath, the meeting of two lives once held together by necessity, now joined by choice. He whispered her name like it meant something sacred. She touched his face like he was hers, not by contract, but by right. And when it was over, when they lay tangled in silence, he held her close, forehead resting against hers, and said the words neither of them had dared to say aloud until now. "I love you, Valerie." Tears slid down her cheeks, quiet and grateful. "I love you too, Alexander." Not as the man who saved her mother, not as the billionaire with a contract, but as the man who had seen every part of her, and stayed. 3 months later, on a spring afternoon filled with the scent of gardenias, Valerie stood barefoot in the backyard of the Morgan estate. Carla sat under a white umbrella, now recovered, smiling with eyes full of wonder. Sophia was beside her, dabbing away tears. Alexander waited under the blooming arbor, dressed in a navy suit, no tie, just the man she loved, free of armor. They were renewing their vows, but this time there were no signatures, no cameras, no staged kiss, only choice, only love. As Valerie walked toward him, a soft breeze lifted her veil and carried a single magnolia petal into the air. She smiled, because what had begun as an agreement had become the kind of love that didn't need to be declared. It had already been proven, in silence, in sacrifice, and in the one night that changed everything. Forever. In the end, it wasn't the contract, not the fortune, not the facade of a perfect marriage. It was what was born in the silence, in the glances, in the gestures that were never required, but that became inevitable. Because true love doesn't need clauses. It only needs courage. Courage to strip away the defenses, to choose someone, even when the whole world expects you to pretend. And now I ask you, could you love someone who entered your life out of obligation, but stayed by choice? If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and tell us in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Your like helps this channel grow and keep bringing emotional stories like this. Share it with someone special.